I fixed her window, and she closed the curtains right after. But that small gesture changed everything. The day started like any other, sunlight spilling lazily over the quiet street. But something about this house felt different the moment I stepped onto its porch. I had been called to fix a simple problem, a window that refused to open fully. Simple, routine work. But when the door opened and she appeared, everything shifted. She was standing there, a woman in her early 40s, exuding calm confidence, her posture graceful yet relaxed. There was a quiet authority in the way she held herself, but her eyes betrayed a gentle vulnerability, like someone accustomed to keeping the world at arm's length. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and even in the soft, everyday light, there was an effortless elegance to her. I found myself momentarily distracted, fumbling for my tools. "Hi," she said, her voice warm but measured, like she was inviting conversation while still keeping a comfortable distance. I nodded, trying to focus on the job, but my eyes couldn't help tracing the subtle movements of her hands as she guided me to the window. The room smelled faintly of fresh linen and old wood, a cozy, lived-in comfort. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the cracked blinds. I knelt to examine the window, noting the stubborn rust in the hinge. She hovered nearby, occasionally brushing her fingers along the sill as if to check the frame's stability. Our hands brushed once, briefly, but it sent an unexpected ripple through me, a subtle awareness I hadn't anticipated. She looked away almost immediately, a faint smile playing at her lips, and yet the tension lingered in the shared space between us. As I worked, I found myself observing her more closely. The way her eyes followed my movements with quiet curiosity. The small gestures that seemed almost unconscious. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. There was something unspoken here, an invisible current that drew me in despite my own self-imposed boundaries. Finally, with a gentle push and a careful lift, the window gave way, sliding open smoothly for the first time in years. I stepped back, expecting a simple thank you. But instead, she reached for the curtains and pulled them closed immediately, blotting out the sunlight I had just welcomed in. A small, private gesture, almost dismissive, but it stirred something strange in me. Curiosity, yes, but also the faintest flicker of desire to understand her, to see why she had shut out the light so quickly. She glanced at me then, a flicker of amusement, or was it challenge? In her eyes. I wanted to ask, to break the delicate barrier that hovered between us, but words felt intrusive in that moment. Instead, I simply nodded, letting the silence speak. And in that quiet, cluttered room, filled with dust, sunlight, and the soft rustle of curtains, I realized this was more than a simple repair. It was the first thread in a story I didn't yet know I was about to unravel. Even a simple act like fixing a window had become a doorway, into her world, into her guarded heart, and into something I wasn't ready to name but already couldn't ignore. I returned to the house a few days later, expecting the job to be quick. A loose latch, perhaps a squeaky hinge, but I found myself already anticipating more than just the repairs. The memory of her, the way she had closed the curtains immediately after I fixed the window, kept replaying in my mind. That small, deliberate motion had seemed almost protective, like she was guarding not just her room, but something deeper, something untold. When the door opened, she was there again, framed by the soft shadow of the hallway. She wore a simple sweater, the color of muted autumn leaves, and jeans that spoke of casual comfort rather than effort. Her hair, still falling loosely around her shoulders, caught the light in a way that made it seem almost luminous. She smiled when she saw me, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes entirely, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. "Thanks for coming back," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. There was a hesitancy in her tone, an invisible wall I could sense but not yet cross. I nodded, shifting my weight as I stepped inside, my hands instinctively brushing against the worn edge of the doorframe. The room smelled faintly of tea and polished wood, a subtle warmth that contrasted with the chill I felt in her careful restraint. As I knelt to inspect the latch, She moved behind me, hands tucked lightly into the pockets of her sweater. Every so often, her sleeve brushed my shoulder, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. I caught her hand almost instinctively, then let go, aware of the silent tension that hung in the air. It was charged, yet delicate, like the first note of a song you don't yet recognize. After I fixed the latch, I stepped back to admire the small improvement. But before I could speak, she moved toward the window and drew the curtains closed again, blotting out the late afternoon light. It was the same gesture as before, deliberate, self-contained, a barrier between us and the world outside. And yet, this time, I noticed a faint hesitation in the way she moved, a slight pause before her fingers tugged the fabric. It was as if she wanted to let the light stay, if only for a moment. I glanced at her, curious, searching for a hint of what lay beneath her guarded exterior. She met my eyes briefly, and there it was again, the subtle flicker of amusement or maybe challenge that made me want to linger just a little longer. Our unspoken conversation stretched across the narrow space between us. My curiosity, her caution, both quietly aware of the tension threading through the room. In that quiet, shadowed room, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a window or a latch. It was about her and her way of keeping the world and perhaps herself at a distance. And somehow, the thought of peeling back that layer, of earning the right to be let inside, felt infinitely more compelling than any repair job I had ever done. Even in her subtle resistance, in the small act of closing the curtains, she had drawn me in further. And I knew then that this story, however slow its pace, was no longer mine alone. It belonged to both of us, in the quiet tension of a room bathed in shadow and the faintest hint of sunlight. Returning to her home became less about work and more about something I didn't quite have a name for. Each visit started with a minor repair, sometimes the window latch, sometimes a squeaky hinge, but over time the repairs felt secondary. What drew me in was her presence, the way her quiet confidence softened in small, unexpected ways. The first subtle change was the light. Whereas before she had closed the curtains immediately, leaving the room half-shadowed, now she would leave them slightly ajar. A narrow strip of sunlight fell across the worn wooden floor, painting long, golden lines that seemed almost deliberate, like an invitation. It was a small gesture, but one that felt intimate, a silent acknowledgement of my presence and perhaps of the trust beginning to grow. Our conversations had started simply enough. How long has the window been stuck? Or, did the new latch hold? But they gradually deepened. I learned she loved old books, preferred quiet music to anything too loud, and enjoyed the comfort of familiar routines. She listened when I talked about my own life, my small ambitions, the little anxieties that surfaced in everyday moments. And I listened, truly listened, to her stories, the pauses between words revealing far more than the sentences themselves. There was a rhythm to our interactions now, a gentle ebb and flow that left room for silences that weren't uncomfortable, but charged. A glance that lingered too long. A laugh that came easily, unexpectedly, when one of us made an offhand comment. Even the smallest touches had started to carry weight. Handing her a screwdriver, our fingers brushing. Adjusting a loose frame, her hand just slightly resting on my arm. Each accidental contact was brief, polite, yet it left a quiet resonance that neither of us could ignore. I began to notice details I hadn't before. The way she tilted her head when considering something, the faint scent of her perfume that lingered in the air after she passed, the subtle warmth of her hand when it briefly met mine. She, too, seemed to notice me in ways that went beyond politeness. The way she paused at the doorway, the flicker of interest in her eyes, the small smile that appeared when she thought I wasn't looking. By the end of that afternoon, as I packed up my tools, I realized the room had shifted from a place of routine work to a space of shared understanding. The sun had moved, slanting differently across the floor, highlighting the faint warmth of our connection. It was quiet, unspoken, yet it was there. A delicate thread weaving us closer, almost imperceptibly, with each visit. Even though the window was now fully functional, the true repair had been something subtler, something within both of us. A crack in the walls we'd built around ourselves, a tiny opening for trust, curiosity, and perhaps something more. I left that day with a feeling I couldn't name yet, a quiet anticipation of the next visit. And somewhere deep down, I sensed she was feeling it too, though neither of us would say it aloud just yet. In those small moments, the sunlight, the brushing of hands, the laughter and silences, I realized the story was no longer just about a window. It was about us, and the slow, careful unraveling of two lives inching closer together, one gentle interaction at a time. It was late afternoon when I returned that day, the kind of soft golden light that spills through windows and makes everything feel quietly sacred. The house seemed smaller somehow, warmer, like it had been waiting for something to shift. I carried my toolkit, but already I knew the repairs were secondary. Today felt like it would be about more than hinges and latches. She met me at the door, her eyes holding a hint of hesitation that was new. Gone was the guarded polish she usually carried. Instead, there was a subtle vulnerability, like she had already decided to let me glimpse a part of herself usually hidden. She led me to the window without a word, though the silence between us felt natural, unforced. I knelt to examine the frame, my hands brushing against the worn wood, and she hovered close, her presence calm yet insistent, like she was testing the boundaries of her own trust. "You know," she began softly, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the quiet room, "I've lived here a long time, and windows have always been tricky for me. I've tried fixing things, but sometimes I get frustrated." There was a pause, and I realized she was speaking not just about the window. Her shoulders tensed slightly, and she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I'd come to recognize as a shield. I looked up at her, meeting her gaze with quiet sincerity. "It's okay," I said, my voice steady but gentle. "We all have things that frustrate us, things we can't always control. Sometimes someone else helping isn't a bad thing." My hand brushed the edge of the sill, near hers, and for a heartbeat, our fingers almost touched. She didn't pull away, though she didn't reach either. That fleeting proximity spoke volumes. As I worked, she began to share more small, personal memories that seemed mundane at first, but were layered with emotion. Evenings spent alone, regrets she carried quietly, fears she never voiced aloud. I listened without interruption, nodding, responding when needed, but mostly just absorbing. There was an intimacy in that shared silence, in the soft confessions spilling across the quiet room. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was real, delicate, and utterly human. At one point, she brushed her hand near mine while adjusting the curtains, a tentative movement that seemed to test the invisible line between us. I held her gaze, letting the moment stretch without forcing it. The sun had dipped lower, casting long, warm shadows across the floor, and the room felt cocooned, private, suspended in time. By the time I packed up my tools, something had shifted. The tension that had always been playful, uncertain, had deepened into something richer, mutual recognition of shared vulnerability. Neither of us spoke the words aloud, but the air between us carried them nonetheless. Acknowledgement, trust, and the beginnings of emotional intimacy. I left that day with a quiet sense of connection that had nothing to do with windows or repairs. It was about the courage to be seen, even just a little, and the magnetic pull of someone who, despite years of guardedness, had allowed me a glimpse inside. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that this story, our story, was no longer about a simple repair. It was about the slow unraveling of walls, the fragile and beautiful opening of hearts, one hesitant moment at a time. By the time I returned that afternoon, the air between us had shifted. The casual warmth and tentative connection of previous visits had grown heavier, denser, like the space itself was charged with unspoken emotion. The house felt alive with anticipation. The quiet creak of the wooden floorboards, the hum of the old radiator, the way sunlight streaked lazily through the half-drawn curtains, illuminating dust motes that seemed to dance just for us. She greeted me with a small, almost shy smile, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other. There was no need for words. The familiarity of our shared space carried its own conversation. She moved with the same grace I had noticed before, but there was a subtle difference today, a hesitancy, a tension that was magnetic rather than reserved. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the curtain as she pulled it back slightly, letting a thin ribbon of light enter. It was a silent invitation, and I felt it. I knelt to examine a loose window latch, my hands close to hers as she assisted. Our fingers brushed. Again. That fleeting contact that seemed mundane on the surface, but beneath it, electricity sparked. Neither of us flinched this time. We shared a glance, a long, loaded look that said everything neither of us dared to speak. My heart thumped in a way that was almost painful in its clarity. She stepped back, holding a tool for me, and as our hands met, I noticed the slight tremor in hers, the tiny sign of vulnerability she couldn't quite mask. I held it longer than necessary, letting the moment linger, aware that both of us were teetering on the edge of something unspoken. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft creak of the window and our synchronized breathing. When I looked up, she was watching me, eyes curious, almost daring me to speak or to act, yet careful not to break the fragile tension. Her lips curved in that familiar, enigmatic smile, and I felt a mix of anticipation and restraint. The room seemed smaller, the shadows deeper, and the golden afternoon light softer, cocooning us in an intimate bubble where only we existed. She leaned slightly forward, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, a mix of warmth and subtle floral notes that made my chest tighten. Every small gesture felt amplified. The tilt of her head, the soft shift of her weight, the lingering brush of her sleeve against my arm. Each movement was deliberate, yet hesitant, a dance of desire and caution. As I finished the repair, our hands touched again, this time longer, more intentional. I noticed the quick intake of her breath, the barely perceptible lift of her shoulders, the way her gaze held mine with an intensity that left no doubt about the emotions simmering beneath the surface. We didn't speak because words would have spoiled it. The room itself seemed to hum with the unspoken acknowledgement of what was building between us. That day, as I packed my tools and prepared to leave, I felt the weight of it all: curiosity, longing, and the silent thrill of being on the verge of something neither of us could fully name. The tension wasn't fleeting. It was a quiet, persistent pull, drawing us closer with every glance, every brush of skin, every shared breath. And in that golden, sunlit room, I realized we were no longer just two people interacting over repairs. We were two hearts beginning to orbit each other, slow and deliberate, caught in the gravity of something profound and inevitable. That evening, the light had softened into the quiet glow of early twilight, painting the room in muted golds and purples. The house felt different this time, less a place of repairs, more a private world suspended between us. When she opened the door, there was a hesitation in her posture I hadn't noticed before, a flicker of vulnerability that pulled me in immediately. "Thanks for coming again," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying a weight that suggested she had something on her mind. I nodded, feeling the gravity in her tone. The window repair was done, but the room was alive with unspoken tension, and I knew this visit would be different. I knelt to check the latch, but my hands moved slower, distracted by the space between us. She hovered nearby, just far enough to respect distance, yet close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her presence. Every gesture mattered. The tilt of her head, the way her fingers lingered on the windowsill, the brief brush of her hand near mine. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about why I closed the curtains so quickly. It's not the light. I don't know. I guess I like to control what comes in, what I let others see. It's easier that way." Her words hung in the air, fragile yet weighty, and I felt a surge of understanding. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "I get it," I said, my voice calm, sincere. "We all have things we hold close, things we guard. But it doesn't have to be a wall. You can let someone in, even a little." There was a long silence. I looked at her then, really looked, at the subtle curve of her lips, the quiet intensity in her eyes, the way she seemed both guarded and open at once. I reached out instinctively, brushing my fingers against hers as I adjusted the latch. She didn't pull away. Instead, our hands lingered, and in that simple contact, a quiet understanding passed between us. I don't usually let people see me like this, she admitted, voice trembling slightly, almost inaudible. But with you it feels different. Safe, in a way I haven't felt in a long time. Her honesty struck me, the vulnerability in her words, the trust in her tone. It was a gift, one I intended to honor. I'm glad, I said softly. And I want you to know, I'm not here to rush anything. I just want to understand, to be here with you. For the first time, the curtains remained partially open, letting the twilight spill gently across the room. The subtle light highlighted her expression, revealing the quiet relief of someone finally seen. Our hands brushed again, tentative but warm, and I felt the invisible distance between us shrink just a little. By the time I left, something had changed irrevocably. We had crossed an unspoken boundary, not of romance yet, but of trust and emotional intimacy. The tension remained, but it had softened into something hopeful, tangible, and profoundly human. That evening, I realized that honesty was the bridge we needed, and every small gesture, the lingering glance, the soft touch, was now charged with meaning. This conversation marked a turning point. The walls weren't gone, but cracks had begun to form, letting in light, warmth, and the slow, inevitable pull of something neither of us could deny. The next morning, sunlight streamed gently through the partially open curtains. It wasn't harsh or intrusive. It was soft, forgiving, and somehow intimate. The room felt different now, warmer, more alive, as if the air itself had absorbed the quiet truths shared between us the night before. I knew today would be the day the story, which had been building in small gestures and glances, would find its first true resolution. When she opened the door, she met my eyes immediately, her expression calm but tinged with a vulnerability I had grown to recognize as genuine. She didn't step back or hesitate. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile, the kind that acknowledges a shared understanding without words. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. The air between us already carried everything that mattered. As I checked the window one last time, I noticed the subtle details. The curtains left slightly open, letting sunlight caress the floorboards, the warmth of her hand brushing briefly against mine as she offered a tool, the way she lingered near the sill, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. Each small movement felt loaded with unspoken meaning, a language only we had developed over weeks of quiet interactions. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying more than gratitude. It was a recognition of the trust and care that had grown between us. I looked up and smiled, feeling the tension that had defined our previous encounters dissolve into something gentler, something secure. I reached for her hand, carefully, respectfully, and she let me hold it for a moment. There was no rush, no expectation, just warmth, just presence. And in that simple touch, I understood the depth of what had developed between us. A connection that didn't need to be forced into words or actions, yet was undeniably real. We stood together by the window, hands brushing lightly, letting the sunlight spill across us. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of life outside, the rustle of leaves, distant traffic, the soft ticking of a clock. Every sound seemed amplified in its intimacy, marking the significance of the moment. I think I can leave the curtains like this for you," she said finally, her voice teasing just enough to make me smile. There was humor in it, yes, but also a clear acknowledgement of the trust she had placed in me. It wasn't just about the curtains. It was about letting someone into her world, into her quiet space, into her life. I squeezed her hand gently, a silent affirmation. No words were necessary. The slow-burn tension, the quiet glances, the tentative touches, all had led to this moment. A simple, human connection grounded in trust, respect, and subtle affection. As I left that day, sunlight warming my back, I felt a profound sense of closure and anticipation. The story wasn't just about a window or a curtain. It was about two people finding each other, carefully, respectfully, and fully aware of the walls they were willing to lower for one another. And in that understanding, there was something permanent. A bond that neither time nor circumstance could easily unravel. The curtains remained partially open, and so did the space between our hearts, ready for whatever would come next, grounded in the quiet, enduring intimacy we had built together. If this slow burn story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in his shoes?